Hello, bruvs. We're back with the Memoirs of Bridget Itla. And we are on, I think, chapter 7, 6, 7, section 7, 6, 7. I don't know. 6, 7, buddy. That's 7. 15 minutes later, I was sitting in my son's room during the quarter of an hour it had taken to get home. From the station, I had learned more about present day Germany than I could have from reading 1,000 articles. Pat wouldn't permit me to talk to the porter who was carrying my luggage, for one couldn't be sure he wasn't an employee of the secret police. He insisted we keep quiet while the cab driver was in earshot. The hotel porter, the lift boy, the chambermaid, all were to be suspected of being spies. And when at last we were alone in his room, Pat hung his jacket on the doorknob so that it covered the keyhole in case some informer might decide to use it. He began to speak as we sat on two chairs he had pushed close to the window. It was impossible to write anything, but now that you're here, we'll have to do the best we can, and at least we have a chance to see each other. You can't imagine how I've been longing to see you. As he was speaking, I studied his face. It was colorless and drawn. I couldn't make up my mind what had caused this, the lack of proper food or the constant awareness of being watched, spied on. We may never have such a good chance to speak freely, so I want to tell you now, he said. I haven't time to choose my words, so forgive me if I'm too rough and don't give you a chance to say a word. I listened to him, trying to summon up my courage. From his manner and what he had already told me, I knew it was going to be pretty bad. Go on, Pat. You know me well enough to know that I can behave like a man when there's trouble. After a little hesitation, Pat began to speak. Perhaps I am mistaken. Perhaps we haven't as much cause for alarm as I have been thinking. It's difficult to keep a perspective in Germany. It's possible. I see things blacker than they really are. One thing is certain. You and I are in a nasty position here. Up to now, the fact that I am English and you were in England was all that saved me. What do you mean, Pat? I'd better tell you everything, then you'll see my, and now your situation, and can judge for yourself. To begin with, there's the relationship between Uncle Adolf and me. We are on the worst possible terms. When I first came here, he made all sorts of promises, even gave me money, and I had no trouble in finding a job. But although the Reich Credit Bank was paying me 189 marks a month after all the deductions, taxes, insurance, contributions to 6 organizations, I actually received only 140 marks, $50, £10. I could live on that in Berlin, but with nothing left over. When I came here at father's request, I was led to expect I could make a decent wage, not just barely exist. If I couldn't do more than pay for my own food, the whole project was a failure. The obvious course, Pat told me, was to look for a better paying job, but no one can change positions in Germany without special consent. When he tried to discuss this with his father, Eloise was furious. No one would dare offer the Führer's nephew any kind of job, regardless of salary, high or low, unless Adolf was willing, and Eloise forbade Pat to take any steps. He seemed to think Pat should be satisfied just to make a living, but Pat didn't take his orders. He wrote to Adolf and explained the situation to him. There was no answer. Next, he explained the situation. Next, he wrote to Angela. She didn't answer either. Pat decided he would have to see Adolf in person to get any action. He went to the chancellery. The anteroom was jammed. No luck. So he waited until late in the evening. Of course, he could go only after business hours. So it was the same story the next time he went. he was unpleasantly surprised by the rudeness of the can't pull the trigger here, buddy. Come on. There you go. Of the attendant, not to him, but to the others who were waiting, most of whom were men of standing. They must all have had important matters to discuss, or they would never have got that far. Yet the SS men treated them like beggars. There was one man who sat there for hours, holding a heavy briefcase on his lap. Pat knew who he was. His picture had been in the papers hundreds of times. An important Rhineland industrialist. He'd been there, since 11 in the morning, but kept waiting patiently. And there's Wilhelm Bruckner. When opportunity offered, he merely stated that he had an appointment. The Fuhrer had sent for him to go over certain plans. He would wait. When he began complaining mildly, one of the stormtroopers planted himself in front of the man, who was old enough to have been his grandfather, and ordered him to leave. The old man stood up and started towards the door, but his measured steps evidently didn't satisfy the SS man, for he came up behind the old man and pushed to hurry him on. It wasn't so much the action itself. The shove wasn't very hard, and the old man wasn't hurt, but the way he did it, grinning at his companions and sneering at the old man's embarrassment, was shocking. And there's Julius Schaub. Pat decided that it was no use trying to see Adolf that way. Instead, he wrote to Adolf's personal adjutant, S.A. Gruppenführer Bruckner, that guy, for an interview. In reply, Pat received a letter asking him to come to his office. Have you heard anything about Schaub or Bruckner in England, mother? Pat suddenly interrupted his narrative to ask. No, I replied, or at least nothing that didn't sound so exaggerated I couldn't credit it. Pat looked at me oddly. Nothing they could say about Uncle Adolf's guardian angel could be too exaggerated. Herr Schaub, Pat told me, is the subject of much popular gossip because of his treatment of his sister, or rather half-sister, who is considered not quite Aryan. He has tormented her so much that she has gradually become a common barfly. At first, she used to frequent the Leichenstrasse nightclub to drown her sorrows. Then she acted as the hostess, trading on her charms and her brother's name to stimulate business. But I skipped a page somewhere. But ever since, he had thrown her out of a lodging house because the landlord was Jewish. She'd been in such a low state running after chauffeur and mechanic who'd buy her a drink that everyone had begun to wonder when she'd be the victim of one of those accidents that had become so frequent. Bruckner, said Pat, is a huge hulk of a man. He drives one of the most expensive cars in the country, given him by Adolf. Makes you think of a modern centaur. Half man, half car. You almost never see him without it, unless he's in a nightclub, or so drunk he can't drive. Then he leaves Baby, that's what he calls his Mercedes, in the street because he can't bear to have anyone drive it. These two men, I learned, are at Adolf's side day and night, and there isn't much choice between them. Schaub's a small man, shy and quiet. Bruckner is coarse and domineering. Both are dangerous. In spite of his grim reputation, S.A. Gruppenführer Bruckner had always been decent enough to Pat before, but the moment he began to speak on this particular occasion, Pat felt a definite hostility in his manner. Bruckner didn't bother to get up or even offer Pat a chair. His tone was rough and impatient. I understand you wish to speak to the Fuhrer, he said. What do you want to see him about? I should like to have an interview with him, Pat said politely. Yes, I know. You would like to earn more money. Bruckner laughed derisively. as if we all wouldn't. Pat told Bruckner he had plenty of offers. All Pat needed was his uncle's consent, because without it, no one would risk hiring him. Bruckner leaned forward slightly and shook his head. You have a suitable position now, he said coldly. The Fuhrer has executed his duty towards you and does not feel called upon to do anything more. He signed Pat's pass and pressed the button. The door opened. The interview was at an end. After this rebuff, Pat tried to figure out why Adolf wouldn't allow him to improve his circumstances. What was Adolf's objection to forcing him to continue on subsistent wages? God damn, I got a canker on my tongue. It's hard to read. Say those S's, it fucking smarts. Pat couldn't arrive at a satisfactory conclusion. I'm not sure I understand why, Pat said thoughtfully, but the fact remains that Adolf has never done anything for his own family. On the contrary, he has made sure they will remain in obscurity. He has been unable to rise with the circumstances, even being able to dispose of the lives of 67 million human beings hasn't been enough to sublimate his desire to tyrannize over his own family. Pat's life at this time was divided sharply into two levels. During working hours, he was an underpaid, underfed, overworked white-collar man, like millions of others. In the evening and on holidays, he was sought after by everyone. At first, he was charmed by Berlin's hospitality and more than glad to be wined and dined on a much more lavish scale than he could afford. But the motive soon became apparent. It was not as himself that they wanted his company, but as the Führer's nephew. Every host had some scheme to sell, some favor to ask. Naturally, no one had an inkling of the true relationship between Pat and Adolf. The whole situation seemed pointless and hopeless. Pat was stumped. Finally, he made his decision. He would go back to England. No matter how hard a time he might have there, it would be infinitely better than this, and he would be home. The first person to whom Pat confided his intention was his employer, Herr Belitz, the director of the Reichskredit Gesellschaft. This kind and sympathetic man was completely taken aback. Does the Führer know? Was his first comment. When Pat shook his head, he said, You must inform your uncle at once. As Berlitz spoke, his manner had undergone a startling change. From the genial cordiality of a powerful executive, it had become the nervous uncertainty of a worried underling. For the first time, Pat realized how precarious the bank director's own position must be. What do you got, bruv? During the following days, Berlitz repeatedly asked Pat whether he had told his uncle. Had he seen him or written, Berlitz's continued solicitude had an effect he could not have anticipated. It spurred Pat to action, but of a sort which would have inspired Berlitz with the greatest misgivings had he known of it. His experience with Bruckner having served as an object lesson as to the futility of indirection, Pat determined to conclude the whole affair, and, with this object in mind, wrote a letter to Adolf, in which he not only said he was returning to England, but poured out all the bitterness he had stored up for months. He would try to find work in England, and if he couldn't get it because of his name, he would make a public declaration that he had nothing to do with Adolf Hitler and wanted nothing to do with him. This is the Memoirs of Bridget Hitler. Pat, I interrupted him at this moment. There's something I don't understand. Does Adolf admit you're his nephew now? After all the fuss earlier. Oh, he glossed it over. First he told me not to speak about it. Then he just sort of forgot the whole thing. Lots of people know, of course. that before he became chancellor, he was terrified of scandal. But the way things are now in this country, it would be impossible for anyone to make a scandal. All the newspapers belong to him. Radio, even public opinion, is directed by him. No, I'm no longer a problem so far as his reputation is concerned. I had a talk with Rudolf Hess, Uncle Adolf's private secretary, on the subject. He made my position clear. Yes, it was true I was Adolf's nephew, and I needn't deny it, but I mustn't take advantage of it either. It would be best, he told me, never to refer to it at all. So that's how it stands. Yeah, I'm not saying bullshit. You really think I need subscribers? I don't need anything, buddy. I see. Well, what happened about the letter? The moment Pat put it into the box, he told me he had misgivings, so it was hardly a surprise that there were immediate repercussions. Next day, Gruppenfuhrer Bruckner, Adolf's adjutant, appeared at the bank to escort Pat to the chancellery. Followed by the unconcealed envy of his fellow employees, Pat stepped into Hitler's private car. He had barely time to settle back before Bruckner began to storm at him. What arrogance, after all the Fuhrer has done for you, to write him such a letter. Pat had been more than ready to regret his rashness, but Bruckner's stinging words acted as a spur to his temper. I don't see why I should account to you for what I write to my uncle, Herr Bruckner, was Pat's retort. Oh, no, but have you no shame that you dared to attempt blackmail against the Fuhrer? Pat was astonished and furious. How dare you make such a charge against me? This outburst was evidently unexpected, for Bruckner made no reply, but sat biting his lip. Then, in a quite different tone, he said, there will be no question of your leaving the country until we know what you propose to tell the English press. So that was it, Pat thought. They were afraid he might talk. He began to see his position more clearly. I am an Englishman, he shouted, and I defy the right of any German to tell me what I have to do. I'll leave Germany when I please, and I'll write what I want. If you have an objection, refer it to the English consul. Is this so? Bruckner laughed shortly, staring at Pat with raised eyebrows. We will see about that. As a matter of fact, and there's Schaub, Hitler, Bruckner, and Hess. Why do you want to leave? He asked. The whole Reich is at your disposal. When Pat made no reply, Bruckner lapsed into silence, saying nothing more until they arrived at the chancellery. Bruckner left Pat waiting in the anteroom while he went into Adolf's office. A quarter of an hour later, he opened the door. Now you can go in. Adolf was alone in his inner office. He sat gazing at the top of his empty desk as Pat entered. Heil! He looked at Pat and smiled. Heil, Pat replied. You never say Heil Hitler when you go into Adolf's office. And anyway, Pat never did. It made him feel silly. Adolf presented a very worldly appearance on that occasion. Dark blue suit, well-groomed hair, manicured nails, fresh shaven with the powder still showing a little. Well, sit down, won't you? He said, ingratiatingly, as though it were a great pleasure to see Pat. From his first word, the impression Pat received in the car with Bruckner was strengthened. Adolf considered Pat's return to England a threat. It would be awkward to interfere with the rights of a British citizen. Pat determined to take advantage of this weapon Bruckner had inadvertently put into his hand. You wrote me a letter, Adolf began. Not a very courteous letter, you must admit. I grant it wasn't very courteous, Pat interrupted, but after all, when I came to Germany, I was promised I'd be able to make a living and send something extra to my mother. Otherwise, I would never have come. I know I could get a better job if you would consent. It seems quite clear now that I made a mistake. I can take a hint. I think it would be best if I returned to England. Obviously annoyed, Adolf began to speak, his tone conciliatory. You have a job and you can maintain yourself on your earnings, he told Pat. What more can you expect? I didn't become chancellor for the benefit of my family. You must understand that a chancellor is in a peculiar situation. I can't have people saying I show favoritism to my family. No one is going to climb on my back. It was funny, Pat said, that all he could think of as Adolf was speaking was his mot on Napoleon, who had put all his brothers in high positions. Then Pat went on with his story. I don't want to climb on anyone's back, he had retorted hotly. I can stand on my own 2 feet, but why should so many obstacles be put in my way? And my mother's. You keep talking about your mother, said Adolf, but she is not too old to work. Why shouldn't she support herself? It's not as though I am in a position to do anything for her myself. You know I am not a rich man. I had been listening to Pat's story without saying a word. Now I couldn't help breaking in. Why, Pat, I don't want anything from Adolf, and anyway, I'm getting on without anyone's help. I know, Mother, but you don't understand. It's the principle of the thing. Uncle Adolf claims to be the only statesman in the world without a bank account, but this is just another example of his hypocrisy. He not only has a personal bank account in the name of Birkenshaw, but he also has several million marks in a joint account with Schaub and Bruckner, which he keeps in the Reich Credit Gesellschaft. Director Berlitz told me, so you can imagine that his remark about not being rich rubbed me the wrong way. But it wouldn't have been clever to reveal my knowledge. I said yes, I knew he wasn't a rich man. Pat's tone must have indicated something of his feelings, for Adolph's expression changed. He began to ruffle the papers on his desk. Picking up a sheet, he said, I've received a number of reports on you. That was something of a jolt to Pat, who could have been sending in reports on him. Adolf replied to Pat's unasked question, Director Berlitz reports on you every month, as we agreed when you were first employed there. Pat doubted it. If Berlitz had been making monthly reports, Pat felt sure he would have at least dropped a hint. In spite of Berlitz's nervousness, they were on very good terms, and Berlitz discussed nearly everything with him. This was a typical trick to undermine Pat's confidence in Berlitz. That's how Adolf ensures his safety, keeping everyone so suspicious that they never dare trust anyone enough to unite against him. Adolf drew his eyes into sternness. You are keeping bad company. You must choose your intimate friends better. But, Uncle, Pat began, I don't. Yes, he repeated severely. You are keeping bad company, dangerous company, and you had better choose better in the future. It is up to you to learn how to behave. Otherwise, and without intention, Pat parroted him. Otherwise, it was too much. Adolph's fist resounded against the desk's heavy top. You'll do as I say. Now you know what I expect. See that I get reports of you in the future. He sat down heavily and drummed his fingers. Yet a moment later, when he spoke again, his voice was quite calm, almost offhand. By the way, about your trip to England, I feel quite sure when you think it over, you'll change your mind. I don't believe it would be desirable for you to go just now. After a few more remarks, the interview ended. When Pat got back to the bank, Director Berlitz congratulated him. Schaub had telephoned that the Fuhrer's instructions were that Pat's salary was to be doubled. Definitely, Adolf didn't want Pat to go back to England. Next day, Pat received his first and last present from the Fuhrer, 100 Reichsmark. That's all. 25 minutes of exasperated joy.